Hello, book lovers and English learners, and welcome to our October live read along. I'm Lydie Bureau and I'm an English teacher in France. I'm also the founder of Lydie's Book Club, a literary workshop, a book club, sorry, what am I saying? A book club for learners of English. And in this book club, I host live readings and workshops of adaptations of classics of literature and contemporary novels in their original text. I also tend to prioritize books that are written by women. Each month, we read and explore a different book for all levels of English. And at the end of each reading week, I meet the members of the book club in a live workshop session that via Zoom to discuss the chapters read over the week. In this month, this October, we are going to read the C1 Advanced adaptation of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a 2008 Penguin edition, Penguin Readers here, edition. And if you want to know more about about this novel and Elizabeth Gaskell's work, then I invite you to listen to the podcast episode 25, an introduction to Elizabeth Gaskell and North and South, which is available on this YouTube channel and also on the Spotify podcast called Read in English. So this is the adaptation, and just for you to have an idea of the difference, this is the original book, the original text. So you can see a big difference between the original text and the C1 adaptation. Right, so today it is our first live reading session, and we're going to read chapters 1 and 2. Hello, Anouk. Welcome. This Sunday, I will host the first live workshop session, and we will cover chapters 1 to 4. So if you want to attend this live workshop session, then just subscribe to Lydie's Book Club. The link is in the description. So you will see on the website page the membership subscription label, and you just click there and let yourself guided. You can find all the information of the upcoming dates of live readings and workshops on my website. Again, just follow the link and you can join at any point. Bear in mind that there are going to be 4 live workshops on this novel, this adaptation. So if you missed the first one or the others, then it's fine. You can catch up and join the other live sessions, and you will be able to watch the recording of the first session or the sessions that you've missed. So once you're a subscriber, then once you are a member of the book club, you'll have access to all the recording workshops that we've done so far. And we've done quite a lot. I started the workshop sessions in May. So they are May, June, August, July, August, September. So there are five workshops that you can watch already. So yeah, loads of watching. You can find also all this information, and also if you're interested in one particular workshop, then you can and you don't necessarily want to become a member of the book club, then just purchase the workshop you're interested in, and you can watch all the recorded sessions in this workshop. So you have a page called the workshop, the live workshop store, and there you will find all the workshops, and you just purchase the one that you're interested in, and you have a private access to it. So it's very easy. Right. So now let's get started. So, North and South here. I'm not going to read the introduction because a lot of info. I don't necessarily read the introduction. Well, I haven't planned to read the introduction. So if you are following the reading, then you can read it at your own in your own time. I guess I can, yeah. I'm just going to read the little intro, the first page, the first introduction, so that you can have an idea of what the story is about. But if you want to know more about Elizabeth Gaskell's work, then I advise you to listen to the podcast episode after this live reading session, after this reading session, or um, or before. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to get started with the introduction. Right. So if you have the book, then you can follow and read along as well. Mr. Thornton ran back up the steps. So here it's in italic, so it's an extract the from the adaptation, not from the real text. Mr. Thornton ran back up the steps to Margaret. I'm all right, she said, and fainted. He picked her up and carried her, still unconscious, into the dining room. There, he laid her on the sofa and cried passionately, Oh, Margaret, no one knows what you mean to me. You're the only woman I ever loved. North and South takes place against the background of the industrial North in mid-19th century England. It tells the story of Margaret Hale, a beautiful, intelligent, proud young woman from an upper class family, admired and loved by everyone who knows her. Margaret's father is a clergyman in the south of the country, but when the family's circumstances change, they move from their beautiful, isolated village to Milton, Northern, a dirty, smoky city in the north, where cotton manufacturing is the main industry. There, Margaret meets a wealthy mill owner, Mr. Thornton. Margaret, who has been brought up to despise people who make money from commerce, dislikes him immediately and finds him hard and unsympathetic towards his workers. But the mill owner, while seeing Margaret is unpleasantly proud, cannot stop himself from falling in love with her. The novel follows the ups and downs of their relationship as Margaret undergoes a series of personal tragedies and the mill workers strike. With dramatic consequences for Mr. Thornton, the changes in outward circumstances are mirrored by great changes in both Margaret and Mr. Thornton. Another man, a clever lawyer called Henry Lennox, is also in love with Margaret. Is it possible for either man to win her? Sorry, it's a little bit dark for some reason. Oh. Okay. Oops. Sorry. I'm back. Okay. Yeah. Is it possible for either man to win her? Okay, so that was the end of the introduction. So if you've got the book, then there are more information. So we read here, and there are more information about the novel, the context of the novel, and then here information about Elizabeth Gaskell's um, life and work, and a little bit of analysis on the novel. So here you've got a lovely picture of taken from the BBC adaptation, the BBC TV adaptation, the mini series. So here is Mr. Thornton here, and here is Margaret, our two main characters. And you can see the background here, the manufacturer here at the back, the cotton manufacturer, and here Mr. Thornton, and here the workers, the factory workers here. So here, as you can see, the cover of the book is the face of the actress playing Margaret. Hello, Kitty. Hi. So I just started reading the introduction of the book. I hope you managed to get the book on time for the reading. So I read this, and now I'm gonna start reading the first chapter here. Okay, right. Okay, chapter 1, a wedding. Edith, Edith, said Margaret gently. Edith, but her cousin had fallen asleep. She lay curled up in the sofa in one of the sitting rooms of the house in Harley Street, looking very lovely in her white dress. The two girls had grown up together, but Edith was Edith. Edith. It's a bit funny because in French we would say Edith, but here Edith was getting married in a few days. And it was only now, when she was going to lose her, that Margaret realized how beautiful and sweet her cousin was. They had been talking about Edith's future life on the Greek island of Corfu, where she would live with Captain Lennox after the wedding. But now she had fallen asleep, and Margaret, who had wanted to discuss her own future, had no one to talk to. Despite the lack of a listener, Margaret's thoughts were happy ones. For the last 10 years, her Aunt Shaw's house in London had been her home. But soon she was going to return to the country vicarage where her parents lived and where she had spent her holidays. So here you understand that Margaret, the main character, did not grow up at her parents' house. She grew up with her aunt in London, at her aunt's, and with her cousin Edith. But now she has to go back to the countryside. She was looking forward to the change, although she regretted the separation from her aunt and cousin. She was thinking dreamingly of the vicarage when Mrs. Shaw called out from the room next door. She had invited some neighbors to dinner, and the ladies were talking in the sitting room, while the husband remained in the dining room. So you see the separation between men and women. Edith, Edith, Margaret rose and went next door. Edith is asleep. Aunt Shaw, Edith is asleep. Aunt Shaw, can I help? All the ladies said, poor child. On receiving this news, and the little dog in Mrs. Shaw's arms began to bark excitedly. Be quiet, Tiny, you naughty little girl. I wanted to ask Edith to bring down her Indian shawls. Would you mind fetching them, Margaret? Margaret went up to the room at the top of the house where the shawls were kept. A shawl is a piece of textile, that you put on your shoulder. 9 years ago, when she had first arrived in Harley Street, this room had been her bedroom. She remembered her first meal there, away from her father and aunt, who were eating below. Margaret had always had her meals with her father and mother. The 18-year-old girl remembered how she had cried that first night, hiding her face under the bedcloth. Now she had learned to love her bedroom, and she looked round regretfully, knowing that she was leaving it forever. She carried the shawls downstairs, and as Edith was still asleep, her aunt asked her to put them on. The long, heavy shawls looked better on Margaret, who was tall and stately, than they would have looked on Edith, who was much shorter. Mrs. Shaw was adjusting her shawl around Miss Margaret's shoulders when the door opened and Captain Lennox's brother, Mr. Henry Lennox, came in. Margaret looked at Mr. Lennox with a laughing face, certain that he would be amused by her situation. Almost immediately, Edith appeared, shaking her pretty curls. She had 100 questions to ask Henry. But he soon came and sat next to Margaret, as she had known he would. Margaret's face lit up with an honest, open smile. Henry Lennox liked and disliked almost the same things as she did, and now she was certain to have a pleasant evening. Well, I suppose you are all very busy indeed, with the ladies' business I'm in. Very different to my business, the law. Serious business. Indian shawls are very lovely, and their prices are good too. But is this not your last dinner party before the wedding on Thursday? You have been very busy recently. Yes, replied Margaret. I wonder if it is possible to have a quiet time before a wedding. What would your wedding be like? Oh, I've never thought much about it. I would like it to be a fine summer morning and to walk to church through shady trees. It is natural for me to think of Helston Church rather than a London one. So Helston is the place where her parents live. Tell me about Helston. Is it a village or a town? Oh, I don't think you could call it a village. There is a church with a few houses near it. Cottages, really, with roses growing all over them. It sounds like a village in a children's story. It is, replied Margaret eagerly. It's like a village in a poem. It sounds lovely. What is the vicarage like? Oh, please don't ask me to describe my home. It's much too difficult. Margaret, don't be cross with me. I'm not cross with you, said Margaret, looking directly at him with her large, soft eyes. Then tell me what you do there. How do you fill your day? I walk a lot. We have no horse, not even for father. Do you go to dances? Oh, no, nothing like that. We don't have the money. I can see you won't tell me anything. Before the holiday ends, I think I will visit you and see what you really do there. I hope you will. Then you will see how beautiful Helston is. Tall, handsome Captain Lennox, who had just arrived, came over to greet his brother, with Edith smiling proudly by his side. The two men shook hands, and Mrs. Shaw welcomed the captain in her gentle way. Her husband had died many years ago, but she lived a very comfortable life. Lately, she had been worrying about her health, and she started a conversation with the captain about the possibility of spending the winter in Italy, where it was warmer. Mr. Henry Lennox leaned against the wall, amused by the family scene. Unlike his brother, he was not handsome, but he had a clever, interesting face, and people liked him. He was enjoying watching the two cousins as they arranged the table for tea. Edith was doing her best to show the captain what a good wife should be. What a good wife she would be. But he noticed that Margaret was much more efficient. So that's the end of chapter 1. So, very short chapter here. And what we can see here is that we are, the narrator is in the position of as the observer. It's written in the third person and third person narrative. So we are in the same position as the narrator. We are watching the scene happening and learning about those characters and their social rank as well, because we can see that Margaret's social background, she does not belong to the upper class, although she's got connections, but in the upper class, like Mrs. Shaw. But her parents are not as wealthy, so she belongs more to the middle class rank. And now that her cousin has to get married, she has to leave the house, leave London. Right. So now chapter 2, Helston. It was the second half of July when Margaret returned home. The trees were a dark, shadowy green. The plants below caught the sunlight as it came through the leaves, and the weather was hot and still. Margaret took long walks with her father, taking pleasure in the sweet forest smells and the wild, free-living creatures that she saw there. This life, at least these walks, were just as Margaret had hoped. She loved her forest and had good friends there. She nursed their babies, read to the old people, and brought food to the sick. Her outdoor life was perfect. Her indoor life had its disadvantages. On arriving home, she had immediately realized that all was not as it should be. Her mother, always so kind and loving towards her, from time to time seemed deeply discontented, so unhappy. Mrs. Hale said that the forest so near to the house affected her health, but her biggest complaints were the family's lack of money. Here again. And her husband's low position in the Church of England. When she mentioned the subject, Mr. Hale would reply sadly that as long as he could do his duty in Little Helston, he was thankful. but there were lines of anxiety on his face that had not been there before, and each day he seemed more lost and confused. Margaret was unprepared for these long hours of discontent. She had known that she would have to give up many luxuries when she returned to Helston, and she had quite enjoyed the idea. There had been a few complaints from her mother when Margaret had spent her holidays at home before, but because the memory of those times were generally happy, she had forgotten the small, less pleasant details. Autumn rains came in the second half of September, and Margaret often had to stay in the house. Helston was at some distance from any neighbours of a familiar social position. It is undoubtedly one of the most isolated places in England, said Mrs. Hale sadly. If only we were within walking distance to Stansfields and the Gormans. The Gormans? Said Margaret. Are those the Gormans who made their furniture in trade in Southampton? I'm glad we don't visit them. I don't like people in trade. I think it's much better for us to know poor country people, people who do not claim to be better than they are. You must not be so hard to please, Margaret dear, said Mrs. Hale, secretly thinking of a young and handsome Mr. Gorman, whom she had once met. That's not true. I like all those who work on the land. I'm sure you don't want to admire butchers and bakers, people like that, do you? But the Gormans were neither butchers nor bakers, but very respectable carriage builders. Nevertheless, carriage building is a trade, and rather a useless one, in my opinion. I would much prefer to walk than travel in a carriage. And Margaret did walk. In spite of the weather, she was so happy outdoors at her father's side that she almost danced. But the evenings were rather difficult to fill pleasantly. Immediately after tea, her father disappeared into his small library, and she and her mother were left alone. Her mother had never enjoyed books much, and when Mrs. Hale began to compare her sister's comfortable life in London with her own life at the vicarage, Margaret would stop talking and listen to the rain it fell as it fell on the sitting room window. Once or twice she wondered if she could ask about a subject of great importance to her. Her old brother, Frederick. He had joined the Navy some years ago and had taken part in a mutiny with the result that he was now unable to return to England, as he would be arrested if he did. Margaret very much wanted to ask where Frederick was now and what he was doing. But an awareness that her mother's bad health dated from the time of the mutiny made her unwilling to do so. Similarly, her father's anxious face made her pause and turn away from the subject each time she approached it. Sorry. Frederick's room was kept exactly as he had left it and was regularly cleaned by Dixon, Mrs. Hale's servant. Dixon lovingly remembered the day when she had first been employed to look after pretty Miss Beresford, as Mrs. Hale had been called then. So here, a lot of information. So as we learn that at the same time as Margaret does when she comes back to her parents, that her mother is not so happy with her life, and that there is some sort of a secret around her brother, Frederick, who cannot come back to England or he's going to be arrested. So this is quite curious here. And Dixon, a servant, the servant, Mrs. Hale's servant, or maid, as we would say, is her maid since she was a little girl. So before she got married. So her maiden name is Beresford, Miss Beresford. Okay. So Dixon is more than just a maid, as we will discover. She is Mrs. Hale's confidant and a friend in a way. Dixon had never thought that Mr. Hale was good enough for her. Was good enough for her dear lady, and considered that he had caused her much heartache. She saw herself as Mrs. Hale's only protector. Frederick had always been her favorite, and her rather stiff manner softened a little when she went in each week to tidy his room. So Dixon's favorite child is Frederick and not Margaret. So she doesn't seem to get on well with Margaret. Well, the both of them. Margaret felt sure that there had been some news of Frederick, unknown to her mother, which was making her kind and gentle father. Which was making her, unknown to her mother, which was making her kind and gentle father anxious. Often in conversation, his mind seemed elsewhere, and he spent more time than usual in his study. But when fine weather came in the second half of October, her worries disappeared, and she thought of nothing except the beauty of the forest. She was preparing to take her artist's notebook and go drawing in the forest when Dixon, through the sitting room door opened and announced, "Mr. Henry Lennox." The sun shone through the window onto Margaret's face as she walked forwards to shake hands with him. "I'm so glad you have come," she said. "Did I not say I would?" he asked. "I have a little note from Edith here it is." "Oh, thank you," exclaimed Margaret, and went to tell her mother that Mr. Lennox had arrived. When she had gone, Mr. Lennox began to look around in his sharp-eyed way. The little sitting room was looking its best in the morning sunlight. The window was open, and roses crept around the corner, while the garden was bright with flowers of every color. But the brightness outside made the colors inside seem faded. The carpet was old, and the house was smaller than he had expected, as Margaret herself seemed so keenly. It's as she said, they have very little money. Oh, sorry, it's in his thoughts. It's as she said, they have very little money, he thought. Margaret returned with her mother, who greeted Mr. Lennox with great friendliness, and it was agreed that the couple should go to draw in the forest and then return for lunch. Margaret led Mr. Lennox through the forest to two little cottages. There, they took out their notebooks, and began to draw the pretty scene. When the time came to show each other what they had done, Margaret discovered that Mr. Lennox had drawn her. I hardly dare tell you how much I like this picture, he said. Margaret turned away to pack up her notebook and pencils, and Mr. Lennox was not quite sure whether she had heard his words. They returned to the vicarage, and the conversation at lunch flowed quietly and pleasantly. After the meal, he suggested that they should walk in the garden. What a perfect life you seem to live here, he said, looking up at the tall forest trees. Looking up at the tall forest trees that enclosed the garden like a nest. Please remember that our skies are not always blue. We have rain and even storms sometimes. Although I do think that Helston is about as perfect as any place in the world. I almost wish, Margaret, said Mr. Lennox, and then hesitated. It was so unusual for the clever lawyer to hesitate that Margaret looked up at him questioningly. Margaret, Mr. Lennox continued, taking her hand. I wish you didn't like Helston so much and that you missed your friends in London more. Enough to make you listen more kindly to someone who is not wealthy. It is true. But who does love you, Margaret? Margaret made a strong effort to be calm and then said, I did not know that you cared for me in that way. I've always thought of you as a friend. But may I hope that at some time you will think of me as a lover? Margaret was silent for a minute or two, trying to discover the truth in her own heart before she replied. Then she said, I've only ever thought of you as a friend. I am sure I can never think of you as anything else. Let us both forget that this conversation has taken place. Mr. Lennox paused before he replied. Then in a colder voice, he said, Of course, as this conversation is rather unpleasant to you, I will try to forget it. You're upset, Margaret said sadly. But how can I help it? She looked so sad as she said this that he struggled for a moment with his real disappointment, and then said more cheerfully but still with a little hardness in his voice, I am not known to be a romantic man, and the only time that I allow myself to be so, I am rejected. 'Twas madness to think that I, a poor lawyer, could hope to marry. The whole tone of these words annoyed Margaret and reminded her and why she could not accept him. And it was fortunate that Mr. Hale appeared just then, and a lighter conversation began. Margaret said little, wondering when Mr. Lennox would go. He, too, was anxious to leave. But to save his self-respect, began talking in a bored kind of way about his life in London. Mr. Hale was puzzled. This was not the man he had met in the city, and at lunch that day. It was a relief to all of them when Mr. Lennox said that he needed to leave immediately in order to catch the 5 o'clock train. At the last moment, Henry Lennox's real self broke through. Margaret, don't dislike me. I have a heart, though I pretend that I do not. I believe I love you more than ever, if I do not hate you for the disdain of your face as you have listened to me during this half hour. Goodbye, Margaret. Margaret. He was gone. The house was locked up for the evening. Margaret sat alone by the fire in the sitting room, with unlit candles in the table behind on the table behind her, thinking about the day, the happy walk, the drawing in the forest, the cheerful lunch, and the uncomfortable, miserable walk in the garden. She felt very unhappy that she had had to refuse him. But what else could she have done when? But what else could she have done when moments after moments after her refusal, he had spoken as if success in life was the only thing that mattered to him? Oh dear, she could have loved him so much if only he had been different. Then she thought that, after all, perhaps he had talked in that cold, hard way to hide his disappointment. She was still considering this when Mr. Hale entered, sighing deeply. Margaret, he said at last, in a sudden, desperate way, can you come into my study? I want to speak to you about something very serious. In the study, Mr. Hale made Margaret take a chair next to him. He stirred the fire and then said shakily, Margaret, I am going to leave Helston. Leave Helston? Father, but why? Because I can no longer be a clergyman in the Church of England. Margaret's immediate response was a feeling of shock and disbelief. Why? Why can you no longer be a clergyman? Is it because of Frederick? It is not about Frederick. It is not about Frederick. It is all me. For a long time now, I've had serious doubts about the authority of the church. These doubts have torn me in two, and are so great that I feel I have no choice. I must leave. But, Father, have you truly considered the consequences? Asked Margaret, bursting into tears. Mr. Hale rose and walked up and down the room, talking to himself in a low voice. Finally, he said, Margaret, I have thought about it for a long time. I must do what my heart and mind tell me. I have arranged things so that we will be leaving Helston in a fortnight. Margaret sat as still as a stone. Margaret sat as still as stone. In a fortnight? Where will where will we go? To Milton Northern, her father answered lifelessly. Milton Northern? The manufacturing town in Darkshire? Yes, he answered in the same depressed way. You remember Mr. Bell, an old friend of mine at Oxford University. He teaches at the university now. I wrote to him about my troubles. His hometown is Milton Northern, and he owns property there which has greatly increased in value since Milton has become such a large manufacturing town. He feels certain that I can earn a living there as a private tutor. A private tutor? Cried Margaret scornfully. Are manufacturers interested in studying ancient Greek literature? So you can see here a little bit of disdain from Margaret and the working class or the trade people. Um, Where was I? Oh, said Mr. Hale. Some of them really seem to be fine fellows. Mr. Bell has recommended me to a Mr. Thornton, a tenant of his, and a very intelligent man, apparently. And mother knows, oh, sorry. And mother knows nothing about this? Asked Margaret fearfully. Nothing. Poor, poor Maria. Margaret, I dare not tell her. No, said Margaret sadly. I will do it. Oh, father, she cried. Tell me it is a terrible dream. You do not really mean it. Mr. Hale sat perfectly still as she spoke. Then he looked at her in the face and said slowly, You must not deceive yourself, Margaret. I do mean it. He looked at her for some moments and she gazed back. Then she rose and, without a look or a word, left the room. I think there is a bit of anger from Margaret, although she doesn't say anything to disrespect her father, but there is a sense of that. And you can see here also the fact that once the father has decided that they should leave, there is no question to discuss. The mother is not even aware of this decision. So you can see here how the household was run and that the decision maker was the man. And there were no discussion of that at the time. That night, Margaret sat by her bedroom window, looking out at the brightly lit church, too full of sorrow to cry, but with a cold pain in her heart that made her feel old and hopeless. The afternoon spent with Mr. Lennox seemed like a dream. The hard reality was that because her father had doubts about the authority of the church, their whole life was going to change. Margaret felt as she never had before, completely alone. That night, she dreamed that Henry Lennox fell from her high tree and was killed. In the morning, she woke feeling exhausted, and the awful reality came back to her. At breakfast, the fine autumn morning made Mrs. Hale feel particularly well, and she talked happily, planning visits to the villagers. Mr. Hale left, saying he would be out for the whole day. Unlike her father, who would have postponed telling the bad news as long as possible, Margaret took a deep breath and asked her mother to walk with her in the garden. There, Margaret told her about Mr. Hale's decision and his plan to leave Helston. So in the end, it's the daughter who's got the courage to tell her mother. So it's interesting to see how um, um, on how the father um, leaves the hard talk to his daughter. He leaves the hard talk with her mother, leaves her daughter, his daughter, the to do the hard talk with her mother. So you can see how the father doesn't really own his decision and the responsibility of his decision. It's a bit like a coward here. Um, there, Margaret told her about Mr. Hale's decision and his plan to leave Helston. At first, her mother did not believe her. He would surely have told me before this, she cried. But when Margaret insisted that they were going to leave Helston in a fortnight, her mother started to cry quietly, unable to bear the thought of leaving in a manufacturing town. But think of the shame, she whispered. Your father is going to leave the church. No one we know will want to know us. For the rest of that day, Margaret never left her mother. When evening came and Mr. Hale returned, his face grey and fearful, his wife threw her returned, his face grey and fearful. His wife threw herself on him and burst into tears, crying, "Oh, Richard, Richard, you should have told us sooner." On hearing this, Margaret left the room and ran up to her bedroom, where she cried bitterly for many hours. But heartbroken as she was, it immediately became clear that her parents were depending on her to make the necessary arrangements for the move to Milton Northern. Mr. Hale was so depressed that he was unable to make any decisions, while Mrs. Hale now became really ill and had to spend most of each day in bed. A fortnight was a very short time, and Margaret felt that a great weight had suddenly been thrown upon her shoulders. However, with Dixon's help, she began to plan the move. And that's the end of chapter 2. So we can see at the end of the chapter how Margaret became this young naive woman, looked after by her aunt, and surrounded in a very luxurious environment. And towards the end of chapter 2, she comes back to reality at Helston and having to deal with the country life daily, although she adapts herself very quickly because she loves being outside, the nature, and all that. But on the other hand, she learns that her father decided without consulting, without talking and asking his wife's opinion on moving out to Milton Northern. She learns that they need to move out, and not only she has to leave this beautiful place and her hometown, but on top of it, she has to take care of all the things, all the logistic things that a moving requires. So she is now in charge of her parents. So there is a shift here in Margaret's position as a child, from a child to become more of an adult, young young adult woman, and who has responsibility now. Her mother is ill, her father is so. He's not, he's a little bit depressed of having to take this decision to leave the church. And if you want to know more about this, basically, it seems like Mr. Hale doesn't have faith in the Church of England anymore. But it's not clearly said, of course, because religion is a very difficult topic. As I explained in the podcast, Elizabeth Gaskell, so the author, is belong to the Unitarian community, which is a branch of the Christianity, but which is more open and more tolerant than the Christians and Catholic, the Church of England. Um, and this is what is happening here for Mr. Hale. So he kind of take his distance from the Church of England. So now we will see in chapter 3 tomorrow what happens for the three of them and how the moving goes. Right. So I hope you enjoyed this live reading. Make sure that you subscribe to the book club membership to attend our first live workshop this Sunday. I hope that you'll be able to join us. And if you can't join us live, then you can have access to the recording of the sessions. No worries about that. So I just wish you now a beautiful end of the day, and I will see you tomorrow live on Instagram again to read chapter 4 and 5 together. Bye.